Hi class, welcome to lesson number 40. So for those of you who have been with me for 39 lessons, we've got a couple more to go and we'll be done with macroeconomics as well. So traditionally we've been talking about macroeconomics from different ways. We've said, hey, you know what, if there's a recession, we know how to fix it from a physical standpoint of view. Now we want to know how, with a monetary policy, how we can fix recessions or how we can fight inflations. Before we do, of course, we need to talk about the homework question. And the homework question from the last class was, show me what happens when in the money market, right, in the money market, which actually is right behind me, right here. Show me in the money market what happens when I move my money supply either to my right or to my left. So it's pretty simple and straightforward, but I think it's still important, okay? Your money market, I was too lazy to write the money, so I just wrote a dollar sign, so don't be fazed by that. But here, so I said money market, right? Always make sure you know the X and Y axis, nominal interest rate as the Y axis. And then you've got your money as the X axis. And then you've got the money supply, which is a vertical line, of course, because it's constant. Remember that, right? It's constant. Then you've got a money demand that's downward sloping because, hey, you know what? As the interest rates go down, it's cheaper to get money, right? Remember that. Remember that concept. So people borrow more money when it's cheaper, okay? So that being said, you got a money supply and a money demand. The equilibrium dictates the price of money, okay? So we've got that. So how about moving money supply? So if it moves to the right, if the money supply moves to the right, that means the money supply is going up, okay? If the money supply is going up, what tends to happen is the interest rates drop. Why? Because if you have more of something, like money in this case, things are less valuable, right? So it's cheaper to borrow money, so therefore interest rates drop. Now what if the opposite effect happens? What if we shift the money supply to the left, or rather the money supply shrinks, right? So if MS goes down, right, the exact opposite should happen. Interest rates go up, right? And guess what? When we do this opposite effect, interest rates don't go down, but they actually go up, right? You go from I2 to I1. Why does that happen? Well, you have less of money, right? Less of something more valuable. It's more all of a sudden more expensive to borrow money. Okay, so this is the basic premises behind the shifting of graphs of in the money market. Okay, don't confuse this with the market for loanable funds. We talked about this in detail in the last class, so don't confuse yourself with that. All right, to my left is the monetary policy options for the Federal Reserve. We said 1, discount rate, the rate at which the banks can get to borrow money from the federal government. 2, the reserve ratio, what the federal government says, how much percentage of the reserves in banks should be present with the banks and how much can be loaned out, right? And 3 is the OMO, the open market operations. What the federal government can do is sell and buy bonds and then shift the money supply accordingly. And we'll teach you exactly how that happens. Okay, that being said, let's start off with number 2. We did talk about this a little in the last class, but let's talk about reserve ratio in more detail. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and erase the money market graph, and we'll talk about reserve ratio. And reserve ratio, we talked about this, I think, for the past 2 or 3 classes. We've said that the reserve ratio is the amount of money that the banks are required to have in their reserves. Pretty straightforward. The rest of which, what do? They loan out because they want to make money, right? Banks want to make money. How do they make money? How do they make profits? Banks are like any other firms, right? Their goal is to make profits. So what do? They loan money. So you come into the bank and you say, hey, you know what? I need $500. The bank says, yeah, I'll give you the $500, but you need to give me something in return. And that something happens to be interest, okay? So you give them interest and that $500 back, and they're happy because they get to make that profit. That interest is their profit. So let's talk about reserve ratios, okay? RR stands for reserve ratio. Okay, what is a reserve ratio? Reserve ratio is the fraction of deposits required by the banks to have in reserves. That's an A, sorry. To have in reserves. Okay, so a lot of words. What does that mean? Well, I said the amount of money that banks need to have in there with them at all times. The rest of which they can loan out to people. And mathematically, this boils down to the fact that reserve ratio, or RR, is equivalent to the required reserves, okay, over the total deposits. Pretty straightforward, right? So let's say that my reserve ratio, which is set by the Federal Reserve, okay? In the United States, it's set by the Federal Reserve. Okay? Federal Reserve comes in and they say, you know what? RR, the required reserve, or the reserve ratio, excuse me, the reserve ratio should be 10%. Let's say a bank has $100, okay? So a bank has $100 in deposits, total deposits are $100. Required reserves should be equivalent to 10%, okay? So X over $100, so required reserves over $100 should equal RR of 10%. What is this X? Well, the X is $10, right? $10 over $100 is 10%. So what does this mean? As long as this bank has $10, the rest, which is $90, right? 100, right? 100 minus 10 is 90. This $90, the bank can go ahead and loan out to other people, and that'll go into the market for loanable funds. Okay? So this is why the RR is important, because the government gets to declare how much banks can, how much should banks loan out and how much should banks actually have with them at all times. Okay? So that's the required reserves, and required reserves is governed by the RR ratio. Okay? So RR stands for reserve ratio, just remember that, and that dictates how much money the banks can have. All right, so we understood that. Now we're going to get into a slightly more complicated concept, but a pretty cool concept called the money multiplier. Okay, so people always talk about this, and people say, how does money multiply, right? How does money go in, and how do you create more money? Okay, so for this reason, I will be a bank, and you're going to be the customer. Okay, and we'll call you. For all intents and purposes, for this example, you will be John, okay? So John comes in and says, you know what, Venkat, so I have a bank, okay? And John, right, comes in with $100, okay? $100. He walks into my bank and he says, here's your $100, okay? And he says, keep this $100, I want to keep it with you, okay? Because, I can earn interest, and instead of it being in my closet or under my mattress, I rather prefer you have it. And I say, great, John, I take your $100, right? And then I quickly check what the reserved ratio is. I just talked about this. RR stands for reserve ratio. Okay, the reserve ratio is the amount that's the federal government says, you know what, Venkat, you definitely need to have 10%. This is just a number that I made up, guys. The reserve ratio is declared by the Federal Reserve, and they can change it at any point in time. So for now, for our example, it's 10%. They say, hey, Venkat, if your bank, you can only have 10%. Definitely need to have 10% of your deposits in reserve. Okay. So originally I have $100 from John, right? So I say, you know what? Let's first look at my reserves, okay? I have $100 right now, but you know what? The government says I only need 10% of my total deposits in reserves. So I take 10%, okay? I take 10% and multiply it by 100, and I get $10. And that's the required amount of reserves I need to have by the Federal Reserve. And so I do that, and I have $10. That's the minimum, okay? So I say I go ahead and put that in my reserve. So this means that I have $90 in excess, okay? This is excess, and if you want to be more clear, you can say excess of reserves. Great. Now, what happens is that my bank, I have $10 in reserves, $90 in excess, right? And now Jill walks in and Jill says, you know what, Venkit? So, and by the way, guys, I have a total of $100 in assets. And remember that word assets I talked about, okay? My total amount that I own, right, is my assets. So I have $100 in assets, right? $10 in reserves, $9 in excess. Jill comes in. Jill says, you know, Venkit, I need about I need about a $90 loan for my new company, okay? And so Jill comes in, right? And Jill says, Jill needs $90, okay, in loans, right? In a loan for her cheese business. She wants to make cheese, okay? And she needs $90 in loans. I say, fine, Jill, that sounds good. For the idea that we're trying to get at, of course, you have to imagine yourself in a macroeconomic level. Things are happening at a much bigger level, right? So imagine for this purpose and for this example that this is the only bank in town, right? This is the only bank in town. So Jill says, yeah, I need $90. I say, fine, Jill, you can get it for $90. You can get the $90 loan, okay? But since I'm the only bank, she has to open the account for her cheese company in my bank, okay? So what tends to happen is a couple different things, okay? Things change because this excess reserve of $90 goes to Jill, okay? It goes to Jill in a form of a loan, okay? In a form of a loan. So now I have $0 in excess reserve, $90 in loan, and still $100 in total assets, okay? By the way, how much people owe you guys? So the people, if someone owes you something, that comes under asset because you technically own that money, okay? You technically own that money. So Jill took a $90 loan from the bank. This bank can put that $90 down as assets, okay? So assets are something you own and loans also come under that. Okay, so Jill, all of a sudden, now what she does is she takes those $90, okay, and she opens up a new account called as the cheese account, okay? The cheese account for her company, Jill Cheese & Co., right? Sounds kind of tacky, but let's go with it. And she comes in and she says, you know, Venkit, I want to open up a new account in your bank using my $90 because I want to use it for my cheese company, but I'll put it in your bank for now, okay? And so I say, fantastic. I take that $90 that she took out of this loan, so I just took this loan out, right? But remember, guys, 10% is always required reserve, right? So $90 times 10% is equal to $9. So out of this $90 that I'm getting from Jill that I loaned out, again, it's a little complicated because Jill needs a $90 loan. She took a $90 loan from me, from my excess reserve. It went to my loan. And now this loan is coming back because I'm the only bank in town, okay? So it's awesome, right? So what happens is $90 out of the $90 I get from Jill, which I loaned out to her, okay? She can obviously have access to this at any point in time, but I'm only required to put 10% in reserves. So $9 of this, okay, $9 of this is going to go into reserves. So 10 plus 9, it becomes 19, okay? And the rest of it goes into my excess reserves, okay? The rest of it goes into my excess reserves of $81. $81, okay? And I have $90 in loans. Remember that. I have $90 in loans. So this is the amount that people owe me. This is the amount in excess reserve, and this is the amount that I actually have in reserves. If we add this up, 9 plus 1, 10, right? Move over here. We have 17, 18, sorry. Yeah, so we have $190, right? We have $190 before we start off with the 100. Remember, we started with the 100. This is the amount that Jill owes me. This is the amount that Jill put in, but I only required to put only $9 of it, and this is my excess amount. This, in turn, $81 can go again and be loaned out to someone else. The point is, this money just went from 100 to 190. It's a tough example to understand because you're thinking, why would I bring back the money to you and how does that loan count as an asset? But the point is that you need to understand a couple of different things. On paper, okay, on paper, this is why we create more money, okay? This is just on paper because in reality, it's not a tangible asset, right? So the point is on paper, Jill owes this bank, or Jill owes me $90, okay? But in reality, she took that $90 and put it back as a new account, okay? out of which $9 went into my reserves and 81 went to my excess. When I have to tally up my assets, I include the loans, the excess reserves, and my reserves. And all of a sudden, I went from 100 to 190. Okay? This is because this money is being loaned out again and again. So what's going to happen is it's going to go from loans to reserves, loans to reserves, loans to reserves. But at the same time, this doesn't go to zero, right? This is adding up as well. So you have this sort of effect, and money multiplies. Okay? Money multiplies. Because when I give you a loan, you come back to me as the bank. Okay? Because we're looking at money as a whole in the economy. Okay? So it's going to come back. Even if you put it in a different account, in a different bank, it's somehow coming back to the entire money market. Okay? And this is how money is multiplied as a whole. Okay? Because someone's loan goes into an account goes into a loan, and the cycle continues. Okay? So we make money out of money. All right? Hard concept, but think about it a little bit, and hopefully you can understand it better. But here's the point. The point is that after we create this money, like, where does it stop? Like, how many times does this thing go around? How many times does this dollar, right, be created into $2, $3, $4, $10, $20, right? What's the limit? Just like we've had a multiplier before for our government spending, we have a multiplier called the money multiplier. And that's something we'll go into right now. So what is the money multiplier? And here's the formula for the money multiplier. Money multiplier says that just like we've had for the government spending multiplier, we have a multiplier for money, and it's a formula, okay? And it's based off of the, well, let's try to guess what's based off of, right? It could be based off of excess reserves, loans, reserves, assets. Well, all of this actually is based on one thing. It's based on these two letters, RR, okay? It stands for required reserves, all right? Or your reserve ratio, your reserve ratio. Okay, reserve ratio. And you guys remember that. It's declared, this is declared by the federal government. This is declared by the federal government and set by the Federal Reserve Board. Okay? So RR really dictates how much money is being multiplied. Why is this true? Well, let's think, okay, let's think. If your required reserve, if your reserve ratios are 10%, okay, versus, let's say your reserve ratio is 90%, there's a huge difference. Because me as a bank, if I get $100, right, and 10% is the reserve ratio, right, 10% is the reserve ratio, I only have to put in $10 in my reserves, and the 90 I can loan out, okay? This I can loan. Okay? And this creates more money. We just went over how that happens. But imagine if it's 90% reserve ratio, right? 90% of 100 happens to be 90, okay? So 90 has to be in reserves and only $10 can be loaned out. So obviously this is not going to multiply as much if there's a high reserve ratio, okay? So the higher the reserve ratio, right, the lower the amount that can be multiplied. Okay? Because the lower amount of money is going out to the market of loanable funds. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's actually use RR, the reserve ratio, and come up with the money multiplier. So mathematically speaking, the money multiplier is as follows. Money multiplier. Okay, the money multiplier states that M, which stands for money multiplier, is equal to 1 over the reserve ratio. What does that mean? So let's say for our argument's sake, the reserve ratio is 10%. Okay? So the money multiplier says the money multiplier is equivalent to 1 over 0.1, which is 10%. That is equal to 1 over 10, which is equal to 10. Okay? So if my reserve ratio is 10%, it states that my money multiplier is 10. What does that mean? So let's say I have $100, okay, in the bank, okay, and I take out, I have a 10% required reserve, right? So $10 is what I need to have in deposits, and 90 is what goes out. Well, the 90 that I have in excess and reserves times out by the money multiplier, which is 10, right? Which is 10 in this case. So I take my excess reserve and multiply it by the money multiplier, and I get the amount that is created that is multiplied in the economy, which happens to be 900 in this case. Okay, so in essence, we've made $90 go into $900 because of this recirculation between loans and reserves. Okay, so let's say that one more time. Okay, because I just want to be clear when it comes to the money multiplier. So how do we come up with the money multiplier? The money multiplier, again, is that we use the letter M. Okay, M is equal to 1 over R, 1 over the reserve ratio. So if my reserve ratio is equivalent to 10%, we said M is equal to 1 over 10, which is 10. Okay, so if I have $100 total in deposits, I'm doing this one more time so it's clear. Okay, and I have a reserve ratio of 10%. I only need to put $10, which is 10% of 100, okay, into reserves. And the remaining 90, which is in excess of reserves. So the question is, how much money is being multiplied in the economy? Well, you take the money multiplier, which is 10, right? You take the money multiplier M, times that by the excess of reserves, and then you get the money being multiplied, okay? Money multiplied. Okay? So in our case, it's 10, which is the money multiplier, times the excess of reserves, 90, and the total money that's being multiplied in the economy, and that's there in the economy at the end of the day, is $900. It's the maximum amount that can be multiplied, and you would get, this is the maximum dollar amount that's been created from $90. Okay? So what if my reserve ratio was actually 90%, right? What if my reserve ratio was 90%? Then your money multiplier is going to be a lot smaller, right? For obvious reasons. So this is why you need to pay attention to the required reserve ratio, because it oftentimes dictates how fluid your money can be. Okay? So that being said, let's go ahead and get into other exciting stuff. Like, let's see, what should we cover today? Let us try to go into, well, we discussed the three options, right? So we said there are three options for monetary policy. One is the change in discount rate. 2 is the change in reserve ratio. And 3 is the open market. Okay, 3 is the open market. So let us see how these actually play into effect. Okay, let's actually, we've talked about a bit about reserve ratio. And I think it's time to actually make monetary policy happen. So let's talk about monetary policy. We switched the MS graph before. We said, okay, well, if we shift money supply to the right, what happens is that interest rates drop. We shift the money supply to the left. In essence, we've shrunk the money supply. Interest rates go up. Now, why does that happen, and how does that happen, and why would you want that to happen? Well, those are the questions that we want to answer. Okay, so let's start with monetary policy. Okay, monetary policy. Okay, let's talk about an expansion. We talked about expansionary fiscal policy. Let's talk about an expansionary monetary policy. Okay, let's talk about expansion. Expansion states that if my money supply goes up, then my interest rates come down. Have we seen that before? Yes, we have, because we've seen the graph for the money market. We've said if money supply shifts to the right, well, there's more money in the market. So if there's more of something, it becomes less valuable. So the price of money comes down. So the interest rates have come down. Okay, we're with everybody. Okay, so we've said that if money is cheaper to borrow, in essence what happens is that there's more investment. Okay, there's more investment. Does everyone follow that? If there's more, if the interest rates drop, it is cheaper to borrow money. Remember, guys, when a firm is thinking about investments, they're thinking about two different things. Okay, they're thinking about R, which is the rate of return, the real rate of return for their investment. Okay, and they're thinking about I, excuse me, small I. The thing about I, right? I is this nominal interest rate, the amount of money that they're paying, right, to borrow money, okay? Interest rate, right, is simply the cost of buying money, okay? So depending on R and I, they get to dictate what they need to get, okay? So investments are dictated by this guy right over here. They're dictated by the nominal interest rates. If the nominal interest rates are going down, it's cheaper to invest, so the investment will go up. Investments, if I is going up, it's more expensive to borrow money, right? It's more expensive to borrow money if I is going up and investments go down. In this case, money supply goes up, interest rates are going down because there's more money. If interest rates are going down, it's cheaper to borrow money, so my investment here goes up. Now everyone remembers that if C, I, G, or X minus M go up, right? What's the immediate effect that takes place? AD goes up, right? And this is how we get to link it, right? This is how we get to link monetary policy, right, to AD. We get to have MS going up, I going down, investment going up, and then we see that AD actually goes up, okay? AD actually goes up. And that's how we decide how monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy work. But let's look at this on a graph, okay? So let's first start with the money market. Okay, and remember the axes, right? You have on the x-axis, right? For those of you that remember, there's money, pretty simple and straightforward. And on the y-axis, you've got nominal interest rate, right? And then you've got a money demand, MD, that's downward sloping, right? And then you've got a money supply that's vertical. Now we said we want to expand, right? We want to expand the economy. Okay, it's expansionary monetary policy, excuse me, which also expands the economy, right? That's why it's called an expansionary policy. So what happens is that MS over here goes to the right because we want to increase the amount of money in the economy, right? That goes from MS1 to MS2, goes to the right. What ends up happening is the interest rates go down. There's more money in the market. What this prompts is that after the interest rates drop, there's more investment in the economy. More investment in the economy means that AD goes up. Well, how do we show this, right? Now, here's the graph that all of us remember, right? Here's price level. Here's RGDP. Everyone remembers this, hopefully. There's the SRAS. We've got a flat line for the SRAS, a growing part, and then an exponential part, right? Hopefully this stuff looks familiar for everybody. Okay, and we're in a recession, right? Because we're trying to expand the economy, and we're trying to expand the economy. Normally we do this because we are in a recessionary economy. So we're in bad times and we need to expand the economy. Okay, so we have an AD, right? Which is the flat part. It's over here, right? The RGDP is not doing so great. It's RGDP. R stands for RGDP in a recession. And because of this jump, right? Because interest rates go down, my investment goes up, and investment goes up, AD shifts to the right. And guess what? You have goes from 81 to 82, and your RGDP moves just like it did last time with the fiscal policy, right? So this is the connection between monetary policy and AD, right? Is that we get to move money supply up, and interest rates come down, investment goes up, AD goes up, and AD gets a shift to the right. When it does, we fix to our GDP, and we're in the flat area. Price levels don't change as much, so it's not as bad. Okay, so this is the biggest, I guess this is our first step into monetary policy, and we've started off with the expansion policy. Contractionary monetary policy is something we'll talk about in the next class. For now, let's review real quick about what we covered in the last class, okay? We talked about reserve ratios. We talked about why those are important, right? Reserve ratios really get to dictate how much money is being multiplied, okay? The lower the reserve ratio, the more money that's being multiplied, because if there's low reserve ratio, right, it means that banks get to loan out more money. That money gets multiplied over and over again. And how much money does it get multiplied? Well, we found the money multiplier. What is a money multiplier? Well, money multiplier is defined as 1 over the reserve ratio, okay? 1 over the reserve ratio, so remember that. The reserve ratio is one of the tools that the federal government uses to monitor and to enforce monetary policy. The two other ways is to have open market operations, which basically means buying and selling bonds. And the other one is changing the discount rate, okay? Lastly, we went over monetary policy and how it affects the economy. We started off with the expansionary policy in the monetary policy, okay? So expansionary monetary policy, where we've increased the money supply, which decreases the interest rates. That increases the investment because it's cheaper to borrow money. And that in turn increases AD, and that's something we went over for last time. Money market here, you see the MS moving to the right, and then you finally see here the difference it's made to the AD, right? Because if I goes down, as MS moves to the right, money's cheaper to borrow, so people invest more, makes your aggregate demand go to the right. That's your demand pull inflation. Okay, and this fixes the economy because my output is bigger and my price levels haven't changed that much. All right, so that being said, let's talk about the homework question. The homework question is going to be pretty easy this time. Just tell me the money multiplier and the formula for it. So that way you can remember a pretty simple concept, but it's also pretty important. I'll see you guys in the next class. Thank you so much.